Welcome back. This is week 12, lecture 2, part 2. There's one slide I have to get through, a very important slide I have to get through in the lecture on Luther and the Reformation in Germany. Um, and so this is, as a whole, both parts will be longer than the hour and 15 minutes of a class presentation. The first part of this lecture was an hour and 17 minutes or something, which I guess I would hold you over in class for to get through it, but I can't hold you over that much. So this will be part 2. I'll make up the time or give you back the time, so to speak, later on. I think I already mentioned perhaps I'll try to do so in the workshop, which is the next lecture. But then we have Calvin and Calvinism, and that's a pretty big lecture too, so I'm not sure I'll be able to get through that. I'll do my best to. But then some of the later lectures will be definitely shorter, I promise you. So overall, the time, you'll have your time back, so to speak. Okay, so we left off with Luther in the Wartburg after his stance at Worms, and how Frederick should be seen really as the father of the Reformation, because without Frederick, Luther would have been captured and sent to Rome. Immediately after the deed of Worms in 1521, somewhere in 1521, when Luther was captured, even his colleagues back in Wittenberg didn't know what was going on. They thought he probably had been captured and sent to Rome. They were worried about him. And also there is a kind of a power vacuum or a leadership vacuum at Wittenberg. Luther was very clear that this was, the whole Wittenberg theology. It was not just him, it was all the faculty at Wittenberg. There were some disputes and divisions, but in general, he already in 1516 wrote a letter saying, our theology and that of Augustine, our Augustinian theology is winning out. And also to show his issue with Aristotle. Aristotle is falling by the wayside. Students are flocking to our lectures. So there was a problem. Who is then in charge of the theology faculty at Wittenberg? Luther had been the central figure, but he's gone. That no one even knows where he is. Two figures: Philip Melanchthon, who was Luther's right-hand man, professor of Greek, whom Luther had kind of trained along to begin to be a theologian too, even though Melanchthon had no formal training in theology. He was a fantastic humanist, scholar of Greek. I could go a lot about him, but he was one of the persons that was looked to because he was a very, very close associate of Luther. And then the other was a man by the name of Andreas Karlstadt, full name Andreas Bodenstein von Karlstadt. Karlstadt was an older colleague. He actually had been the one to have conferred the doctorate on Luther at Wittenberg. And there had already been conflicts with Luther, between Luther and Karlstadt. In 1516, there was a disputation held for one of Luther's students. I talk about students. This is a disputation that Luther wrote the thesis and had his students Bartholomew of Feldkirch defend them as part of his academic program. And Bartholomew had claimed that the treatise on true and false penance was not really by Augustine. It had always been attributed to Augustine, or not maybe always, but for a long time had been considered to be one of Augustine's authentic works, and Bartholomew said, no, it's not. Well, this is a public disputation, keep in mind. And Karlstadt got up and said, no, you're wrong. It is by Augustine, so you're misinterpreting all of Augustine. And Luther then stood up and humiliated Karlstadt. He said, have you actually read the treatise? If you had, you'd know better. This is not by Augustine. Absolutely not. No, scholars say it's not by Augustine. So, to Karlstadt's credit, he went out and went to the Frankfurt Book Fair and bought the entire Opera Omnia of Augustine, which had recently been published by Froben. Emerbach, by Emerbach. Froben was later. Erasmus' edition. Froben was 1529. Emerbach edition, I think, was 1508. The Emerbach edition of Augustine's works. And read them. And it was like, oh my God, Luther was right. And in 1518, Karlstadt published a new commentary on Augustine's letter, or Augustine's treatise on the spirit in the letter. And in some ways, Karlstadt became more radical than Luther. And in Luther's absence, he seized control of Wittenberg and what was going on at Wittenberg while Luther was in the Wartburg. This is the point of the radicals of Wittenberg. He was the first to proclaim that he would hold the first evangelical mass. Again, evangelical based on the Evangelium, the gospel, not really having anything to do, again, with what the term refers to today, the evangelicals. But what he meant by that was he would distribute the bread and the wine in both kinds to everybody. It was common, I think I talked about this with the Hussites, to only give the laity the bread, and only the priest would drink the wine. But yet the Utrechists, part of the Hussite movement, received the dispensation to receive both kinds. So it's not necessarily a matter of doctrine as such, it's a matter of practice. So Karlstadt said, I'm going to do it. So he appears at this Mass at Christmas time in 1521. He's not wearing his priestly vestments, and he celebrates it. And people are like, they're afraid, they're scared, because this is something very, very new. Karlstadt also got the Wittenberg City Council to pass a new series of laws called the Wittenberg Ordinances in early 1522 to completely reform church practices in Wittenberg, including the destruction of images. This was the first outbreak of what became known as iconoclasm, feeling that the worship of images, or what was seen as the worship of images, was wrong and therefore should be banned, so images should be taken out of the churches. There's a huge story behind this, goes all the way back. I think I mentioned in an early lecture the iconoclastic controversy of the 8th century, which led actually to the crowning of Charlemagne eventually in 800. So this was not a new issue, and the theologians in the West had already solved it with that distinction between latria and dulia. Dulia is worship, latria is veneration. But that became blurred again, and Karlstadt's point was we got to get rid of images. So there's going to be breaking of images. And meanwhile, Luther is in the Wartburg. He began to start translating the Bible into German, and I don't know if I'll be able to get back to that, but his whole point of that was, yes, he wanted people to read the Bible, but he wanted them to understand it as he understood it, not just to read it for themselves. The view of Luther's doctrine of so-called sola scriptura, I mean that anybody could read the Bible and interpret for themselves, was absolutely wrong. Luther got rid of the medieval glosses, but he added his own glosses to the Bible to say, this is what this means, this is how this should be interpreted. What he meant that sola scriptura was that when we are determining theological doctrine or church practice, we should not refer to tradition, but only to Scripture. That's what he meant. It was not a reference to anybody can read the Bible. Yes, Luther wanted everybody to read the Bible. That's why he was translating it into German, which is a great, huge achievement of his. It set the German language. What today, if you've taken German in high school or here at IUI, the German you're taught is called High German, and that High Modern German, and that is the German that Luther created in his translation. And I could talk a lot about that. It's a brilliant work, but that gets to be a long story too. But his September Testament, his New Testament, came out in 1522. He's translating it while he's there at the Wartburg, and he had sent word back to Wittenberg of where he was and what was going on. He writes back to ask for help in terms of the translation. And interestingly enough, he did not base his translation on the Greek, but on the Latin, the Vulgate. He referred to the Greek at times, but he really is, Philip Melanchthon was the Greek scholar. Luther wasn't. He could read biblical Greek. But it's been shown that he really based his translation on the Latin, and he wanted to base his translation to be a lively translation that everybody could understand. So he's asking for help of how you would translate this, what are the people saying, and how do they phrase things. And he's doing that while he's at the Wartburg. And so there starts to be a communication back and forth, and he hears what's going on in Wittenberg. And he's appalled. And that being so appalled, especially with the iconoclasm and the evangelical Mass, getting rid of the Latin Mass and everything else, Luther returns to Wittenberg in March of 1522, preaches a series of 8 sermons called the Invocavit sermons, based on the Invocavit Sunday, to restore order. And he excoriates Karlstadt and the changes that have been made. He's saying there's one thing, maybe theoretically they're not necessarily wrong, but practically they're not right yet. We have to teach people, we have to be aware of their conscience, what's going to happen if they, when they take the wine for themselves for the first time. It's going to be freaky out, breaking images. Why should they break images? All these kinds of things. We have to teach them the right understanding of images. We have to teach them the right understanding of the Eucharist. And we should still keep the Mass in Latin. Now, Luther ended up running a German Mass himself. He said, first, we need to just slow down here. So he establishes, Karlstadt is again humiliated, and he flees Wittenberg. He goes to and starts to become known as Brother Andrew. He ends up being the pastor in the city of Orlamünde, and he's often seen as the father of the Baptists. And that's just the whole long story itself, because he's not the only one. There's also Swiss Baptists. And these two were beginning to develop in Switzerland as Luther's controversy is going along. But he was the leader of the radical movement at Wittenberg as Karlstadt, and he then leaves. Luther's reestablished order, just as Zwingli, Ulrich von Zwingli in Zurich, the Swiss city of Zurich, is beginning his own Reformation. And that's a long story too. It really becomes what became the foundation of what's called the Reformed tradition, which is a bit distinct from Calvinism, which I'll be talking about in the lecture after the workshop. But it's a very different approach from Luther's. But still, these Swiss cities, the Swiss cantons, were independent city-states, the Eidgenossen. They were quote-unquote German, and they're very similar to some of the free imperial cities in southern Germany. And so it's really a movement that is parallel to Luther's. Zwingli said he developed his theology independent of Luther, and that's probably a combination of not simply following Luther, but nor is it simply Zwingli coming up with his own ideas. There's probably some interaction and influence there. But he starts changing things too. And there were some radical Swiss theologians too who went even further and started advocating for adult baptism rather than infant baptism. Zwingli still adhered to infant baptism, but it's kind of like once you let the lid off of the boiling pot, it goes everywhere. That's what was going on in these early years of the 1520s. People were misunderstanding what the issues were all about, what Luther's position was all about. Luther ended up calling all these people his false brethren, people who claimed that they were, just following in his wake, but they, according to Luther, they were just completely wrong. He said they're worse than the papists. So it gets to be a real problem. Zwingli, I'm not going to say a lot more about. I'll come back to him later on, and even in this slide, because he has an important role to play. And the problem was that with all this boiling pot with the lid off, was that Charles V, the emperor, was distracted. He did not have the leisure to focus his attention on all these religious problems that were busting up everywhere. That's why that allowed Frederick to kidnap Luther. I mean, it didn't allow it, but it meant that Charles didn't all of a sudden move against Frederick. Why? Because he's fighting France. I mentioned Francis I, the young King of France. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about the early 16th century. We have Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, young man. We have Francis I, King of France, young man. We have Henry VIII, King of England, young man. Charles V, I'll portray in a later lecture, what I refer to as the last medieval emperor. Francis I, I refer to as the first early modern monarch. He ends up making, a little bit later on, an alliance with Suleiman the Magnificent, the leader of the Turk, against Charles, which was a shock. But how can this happen? But anyway, there's a series of what's called the Habsburg-Valois Wars. So Charles is busy other places in France and trying to put down revolts and stuff in Spain, and he has issues on his hands that he can't focus on, let's say, domestic policy. In some ways, we could put it in terms of Charles was distracted with international issues for him, that he couldn't focus on domestic issues of the Luther movement and what was going on, and then with the Swiss, increasing Swiss movement of these independent Swiss city-states. How do we deal with things? So there's a real problem there. And then, with all of this, in 1524 broke out widespread rebellion in southwestern Germany, which includes parts of the Swiss areas, which has become known as the German Peasants' War of 1525. Now, it's been said that the phrase the German Peasants' War of 1525 was neither strictly German, nor was it strictly peasants, nor was it really a war, nor was it limited to 1525. Fine, that's valid. But the title is the German Peasants' War of 1525. There had been peasant uprisings before in the later 15th century, on in the early 16th century, the Bunshu. These were, peasants who were rising up against what they felt was the cracking down on their traditional rights as peasants. And this all came to a head and then joined with the Lutheran issue, the cause of Luther that was going on, led to this widespread revolt. And it was led by also some radical individuals like Thomas Müntzer, who called for the abolition of the princes and the magistrates, but also just by normal, quote unquote, peasants who were just fed up with it. Their livelihood was being restricted, and that was because the economic problems of the lower nobilities were being restricted. They couldn't really afford to live the life that they were required to live, so they try to pass that on to the peasants. It gets to be a real social, economic problem. And so there are a series of widespread revolts articulated by city secretaries, Stadtschreiber, as they were called. And we have articles of grievances of the peasantry. Now, there were articles of grievances presented to the Reichstag, of the Diet of Worms in 1521, together with Luther, that also criticized indulgences and also some of these social issues. So there's a lot. This didn't come out of nowhere, but it is encapsulated in what's called the Peasants' War of 1525. And the leaders, the magistrates, who are the noble rulers of territories, everything from lower level knights to the emperor himself, so this is wrong. The peasants also are appealing to the gospel. The most famous list of grievances is called the 12 Articles of the Peasantry, written by two Stadtschreiber. And it is proclaiming Christian freedom. And it ends by saying, we will happily be followed if we can be shown that we're wrong and that how our positions are not based on the gospel. We will gladly adhere to them, to the gospel teaching, but we believe that this is the true teaching. They viewed Christian freedom as social freedom. They're not, even though asking to be equal, they're not asking to be, equal with the lords, their feudal overlords. They're simply saying, give us our traditional rights as peasants. We're happy to serve, work for our lords. We know that. There's no problem with that. We're happy to be peasants. But give us our traditional rights. Allow us to live decently. We should be treated as Christians. The freedom of a Christian means that we can call out the abuses, would seem to be reasonable. Friedrich Engels, in the 19th century, the Societe of Marx, wrote a book on the German Peasants' War and sees it as really the first failed bourgeois revolution, and that if only it had been successful and if only the princes had sided with the peasants, Germany might have developed far more advancedly than the other territories. Instead, it sent Germany back into the backwater, which is much slower development. So he saw this as really a failed opportunity. The point here is that we have to understand what the peasants were actually asking for and what they were rebelling about. And they were rebelling about what they considered to be the abuse of their traditional rights as peasants. They wanted to call their own pastors, for example, which was never an issue. So there are new elements in these articles of the peasants. Wanted to call their own pastors, wanted to be able to work with their own parishes. Luther later wrote a treatise on the Gemeinde, the community, and how that should be organized and could be organized. And yet, so some of the complaints of the peasants, Luther was sympathetic with and agreed with in some ways. There was something called the communal reformation that was developing too in terms of local communities and making changes in terms of the ecclesiastical structure. Because what do you do when you get rid of the papacy? What do you do? It was clear before, but now if you throw that all off, how do you go about establishing a new ecclesiastical order, which, as I've tried to emphasize, is always also political. But yet rebellion and revolution is not part of it. This the revolution of the common man. This has all been called too, in terms of the communal reformation, the revolution of the common man. And the princes stood firmly against it. And even Luther wrote a treatise against the murdering hordes of peasants, in which he says, stab, slay, and kill the rebellious, murdering hordes of peasants, princes. You will merit your salvation by the amount of peasant blood you spill. That was Luther in response to rebellious peasants. His point was that Christian freedom, even his treatise on Christian liberty of 1520, has nothing to do with social liberty or freedom. It had to do with spiritual freedom. It's a complex treatise. I'm not going to go into all that. But he felt that his stance in attack against the papacy in Rome was being completely misused and was being co-opted for individuals' own private agendas. And he was furious. And Charles, meanwhile, still couldn't really deal with this. The princes, though, organized and they repressed the peasants. And on it goes. Zwingli later, a later phase of this, later military clash, died in the battlefield of Kappel in 1531. Not part of the Peasants' War, but it was part of this ongoing unrest, ongoing conflict. And the German estates, the German princes, after putting down the war, said we really need to somehow deal with this. The emperor's fighting France and northern Italy. How do we deal with this? So we have a Diet, a Reichstag, which is the meeting of the imperial legislature in the city of Speyer in 1526, which they did. But Charles wasn't there, so what do we do? Well, we can't do much without that. We think that the Edict of Worms at the Reichstag of 1521 condemning Luther should be enforced, but we can't really do much about it yet. So we'll do it again in 1529. And the Diet of Speyer in 1529 is extremely important. Why? Because again, Charles wasn't there. But they said, at least we're going to try to settle the issue. And the imperial legislature, the Reichstag, determined that the Edict of Worms was the official policy of the empire. Luther still should be arrested, sent to Rome for heresy, and his books confiscated and burned, meaning the Edict of Worms had to be enforced. What do you do with princes who aren't enforcing it? What do we do with this? A number of German princes, a number of German free imperial cities walked out of the Diet of Speyer. They said, no, we are not going to enforce the Edict of Worms. We protest this decision. And walked out, and on that basis, from that point on, they became known as the protesting princes and cities, the Protestants. That's the origin of the name Protestant. It was a political opposition to the official legislature of the empire and the decisions that it made to enforce the Diet of Worms. And then it's like, oh my God, this is going to be leading to civil war. We have one last chance. That is in the next imperial Diet, meeting of the Imperial Reichstag, which will be held in Augsburg in 1530. And Charles himself will be there. Charles had figured things out. Okay, we're all set. He'll be there. And we can finally settle the issue. But we have to then put our house in order. And one of the things they did was to say, when this time is Duke John, or Elector John of Saxony, the successor of Frederick. Frederick died. I forget when Frederick died. If we can get the Swiss South German cities together with our German Protestants, the cities and princes, we can present a united Protestant front against the emperor, which will help. But to do that, we have to get Zwingli and Luther together. And the Margrave, the Count of Hesse, Philip of Hesse, said, I will offer my castle in Marburg to host this attempt to get a common front between Zwingli and Luther, so we at least have our ducks in order and aligned, so to speak. This became known as the Colloquy of Marburg. We're going to get Luther and Zwingli together. And Philip of Hesse was a big supporter of Luther, so Luther could go to Marburg. He was still under the imperial ban and the papal excommunication. and talks with Zwingli. Now, Zwingli and Luther could agree about everything, just about. They agreed on the doctrine of justification, passive righteousness. They agreed on more or less on this, on some of the other theological issues, but they could not agree on the Eucharist. Supposedly, Luther had said, supposedly Luther, when he went in there on the table, pulled back the tablecloth and took out his knife and carved in "Hoc est corpus meum," this is my body, and then covered it back up. And when they finally got to the issue of the Eucharist, he threw back the cloth, revealing what he had written. He says, when my Lord and Savior says, "This is my body," he meant, "This is my body. I gnaw on the flesh of my Redeemer." This is a real physical presence. Now, Luther did not agree with transubstantiation. Luther's position was known as consubstantiation. The formula was in, with, and under the elements of bread and wine is the true physical body and blood of Christ for those who receive in faith. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole complexities of Eucharistic theology here, but the point being is that this was a central issue, not only theologically, not only philosophically, because it gets into the issue of Aristotelian physics again, and transubstantiation, and substance and accidents, and what is actually going on with these elements, but also of politics. Zwingli interpreted the words "Hoc est corpus meum," "this is my body," as this signifies or represents or symbolizes my body. That was an interpretation that was first developed and brought forward by some of these Swiss radicals in the early 1520s, who had even gone to Wittenberg and talked with Melanchthon. That it doesn't mean "is" as actually. So the whole point was, what does the word "is" mean? The verb "to be." Does it mean actually to be, or does it mean symbolize, signifies? I'll be talking about some of this actually in the workshop in the next lecture. But that is what is going on here, or was going on here. And Zwingli and Luther could not agree, and therefore there could be no unified front against the emperor. And Martin Butzer was a young reformer there, one of the young reforming Protestant theologians. He was working in Strasbourg, and he said, future generations will laugh at us because the doctrine that should unite us, the Eucharist, is dividing us. So Zwingli went back to Zurich. Luther went back to Wittenberg with Melanchthon and the contingent from Wittenberg. It wasn't just the two of them. And they realized we have to go to Augsburg, the Diet of Augsburg coming up in 1530, on our own. So what we need to do, we Germans, we have to present where we stand on ecclesiastical issues, on theological issues, and in terms of our political stance too. We want to be obedient to the emperor, but we are in contradiction of imperial policy. How do we handle that? It's like war is going to come, but this is our last chance to convince the Reichstag, the legislature, of the legitimacy of our cause. They put together what became known as the Confession of Augsburg, that would then present their case to the imperial legislature. Zwingli and the Swiss from the other Swiss cities got together and they presented their own confession as well, Confessio Tetrapolitana, as it became known as, in Latin, or the Confession of the Four Cities, just as the Confession of Augsburg of the Germans was known as the Confessio Augustana for Augsburg. Melanchthon wrote most of it. Luther could not go to Augsburg with the emperor sitting there. He was a condemned heretic by the Pope and was under the ban of the emperor after the Diet of Worms in 1521. He could not go. He no longer had safe protection. But Melanchthon could go and present their case. Melanchthon wrote this document, and it's a physical document, the Confession of Augsburg. Luther approved it. He said, well, I wouldn't have stepped quite so lightly. But go, Philip, go. So he goes to Augsburg, and once again, the imperial diet, the imperial legislature, rejects it. These are the protesting princes. They're in open rebellion against the emperor. We're not going to accept this, and they're wrong to begin with. Problems. because now that was their last chance. They knew what was coming: civil war. They were in open rebellion against the emperor. Time and again, they had been denied. We better prepare for it. So Philip of Hesse organized and established what was called as the League of Schmalkalden. It was a Protestant German princes and cities, and everyone else wanted to go, military defense league in preparing for war against the emperor. Established in 1531. We'll see the effects of that later on. But this Confession of Augsburg became the basis for what became known as introducing the Reformation. So if a city or a territory wanted to become Protestant in Germany, that was based on the Confession of Augsburg, having to accept the positions of the Confession of Augsburg for the reorganization, reformation of ecclesiastical policy and political policy there. Just as enforcing or not enforcing the Edict of Worms was the issue too. Those territories that would enforce the Edict of Worms were the Catholic territories. Those that refused were the Protestant territories, refusing to enforce the Edict of Worms, enforcing instead the Confession of Augsburg. That is what this is about. And there is a cold war between the League of Schmalkalden and the Emperor for the next 24 years. That broke out in open hot war only a couple of times. I'll be talking about that in the next, or one of the later lectures. But the point here, too, is this was the beginning of a process that was known as confessionalization. And one of the later lectures focuses on confessionalization, which I'll talk about then, whereby adherence to a document, a written confession, which is not a, oh, I'm sorry. It is this is really the here I stand. It's confessio as a profession of what we believe, and this is the political religious policy of the German Protestants. That is what was going on. And with this, by 1530, we're no longer in the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. This is new. Already with Luther's attack against the papacy as the Antichrist in 1520, as I said, not just the Pope is Antichrist, but the papacy is Antichrist. And his attack and calls for a general council and everything else, which has already been seen as not being condemned. But a call to the German nation, addressed to the Christian princes of the German nation to rise up against the papacy. We're already in a new world. And so Luther really had straddled and gone from being what I argued as being the culmination of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, which goes from, I kind of argued, 1300 to, let's say, 1520, to becoming part of the new Reformation, Protestant Reformation. Also, they're talking about Catholic Reformation, so it's not just Protestants, but Protestant Reformation in Germany, of what he unleashed and what then he contributed to. That's what's going on here. And we'll see the impact thereof and the further developments thereof as we go through the rest of the lectures for the course. But for now, that's it with Reformation in Germany. We have the workshop, which I'll try to abbreviate as much as possible. And then we have the Calvin. We have to turn for Calvinism, because Calvin, as a second generation, in so many ways, had a greater impact on the West than did Luther. But we'll get there when we get there. We'll see different patterns of Reformation emerging as Europe is being transformed from medieval to early modern forms of culture, politics, society, and intellectual understanding. That's what we're getting to. It's not one swinging door. It's a long process of transition and change, a change of paradigm. That's what this is all about. But became fundamental for the understanding of the West and for our understanding of the West even today. Thank you so much. Thank you for your patience. Bye-bye.